What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. So there's like two kinds of comic books in the world, right? Like comic books that are good, and then there's comics that are like the best thing coming out of DC Rebirth, and Super Sons is one of those. God, I love this story so much. Super Sons is so fun because it's just like this question that was asked: what if we created a story where we have a couple of like kids with superpowers just goofing off? Yeah, man, let's write that story. Or what are we gonna call it? Super Sons! So the cool thing about this is, remember, Super Sons focuses heavily on Damian Wayne, the biological son of Bruce Wayne, and Jonathan Kent, the biological son of Superman. And it's cool because over the course of their publication history, we've seen Superman and Batman friends, we've seen them enemies, we've seen them in almost every scenario in terms of how friends relate to each other. And so it makes sense that if the two of them were gonna have sons, their sons would follow the exact same path. And that's the cool thing about this, because while the writing's better than it was back in the 1940s and 1950s and 60s in a lot of different ways, what you guys are reading right now is basically what we saw in the early stories way back in, before Crisis on Infinite Earths with Batman and Superman. We saw some bickering, but for the most part, they always got along. Again, this story comes from the aftermath of the first Super Sons video we did, which basically saw them taking on Kid Amazo, which was a guy who basically began going through and duplicating the powers of other heroes and then using them with the intention of world domination. Now, of course, it was a little kid and it was largely just Superman and Batman's abilities and powers that were being copied, and that was really about it. But in this instance, because of the fact that Damian Wayne had basically grabbed Jonathan Kent and took him on the adventure, when it was all said and done, they were both grounded because they're both kids and they both basically snuck out. This is the immediate aftermath to all that, in the sense that Damian Wayne is basically grounded. Now, the other half of this is that so is Jonathan Kent, but he's grounded away from being able to use his powers. Now, I'll be honest with you guys, Jonathan Kent is like my favorite character in DC right now. He is hilarious. Like, I absolutely love his whole thing because he's so young and vibrant and like brings a fresh perspective to comics. And that's the cool thing about him in DC, is because for a lot of teenagers, they went through the same thing that he did, right? Like, you go through here, you look at this whole Jonathan Kent thing, and a lot of teenagers went through the same situation. I mean, remember, he's basically in his preteen years. He's not quite a teenager yet, but he's approaching that point in his life when he wants independence, when he wants to be able to go out and form his own little niche in the world. Now, he's not experienced enough. He doesn't have the wherewithal to know the kind of dangers that are out there, but that's the give and take that comes with being a teenager. It's you basically battling against your parents. And so in this case of Jonathan Kent, the biggest issue that he has is that Lois Lane and Superman are wanting to move back to Metropolis. Now, remember, in DC Rebirth, when it came to Action Comics and the Superman comics, basically two stories, both detailing the life of Superman and his supporting characters, while they were telling two different events, the common theme between Action Comics and Superman is that it dealt with the idea of wrapping up all loose ends. It dealt with the idea of removing the New 52 Lois Lane. It dealt with the idea of removing the New 52 Superman and taking classic Lois Lane and classic Superman and putting them in their place. And so what this has basically happened, what it's really come to at the time this story is being written, and especially when it comes to Superman comics, is that it basically focuses on this idea that they are now in their positions, they're now in their roles, and DC's taking the next logical step, which is to move them to Metropolis. The problem with this is, like any kid in that scenario, Jonathan doesn't like change. Now, that's a common thread when it comes to like just human beings in general, right? Like, we get used to things being a certain way, we get accustomed to things being a certain way, and we don't like it when they change. And so in this instance, Jonathan knows the life that he lives. He knows the friends that he has. He knows the environment of Hamilton County. He does not want to move away from that, lose the life that he's built on the auspices that he has to go move forward, move to Metropolis, and start a life anew. The other half of this is that, again, he's growing into becoming this angsty kid, challenging barriers. And so because of the fact that he'd been grounded from using his powers, he lashes out and simply saying, well, you guys just want to take everything that I love and care about, and you guys want to move me to a town that I don't know anything about, hiding me away from the world. It's all this frustration, all this irritation, all this young angstiness just coming to bear and him just lashing out into the world. And so because of this, because of the fact that he looks at his current predicament as basically being a byproduct of Damian Wayne grabbing him and then taking him into this conflict against Amazo, he does what any young kid that doesn't really know what's going on, he does exactly what they would do, and he just goes after Damian Wayne. Now, this is cool because this is really kind of like this toned down comedic, but still somewhat having ties to to the battles of Superman and Batman. Now, of course, much like the Batman-Superman stories, this follows the exact same way, in the sense that they basically fight one another, but it's a fight to a stalemate. Now, in truth, this is all just about inexperience. I mean, Damian Wayne is very, very capable in what he can do, but Jonathan Kent is not. But what Jonathan Kent lacks in experience, he makes up for in durability and speed and strength, so on and so forth. And so again, what ends up happening here is with the two of them trying to beat the crap out of one another and not doing a very good job, the whole conflict is suddenly stopped by Alfred. Alfred basically walks in and he's like, what in the world is going on here? Now, of course, this leads to Damian Wayne having this genius idea of crawling into a hatch. This is basically in the, well, there's no other way to say it, basically in the anus of the giant dinosaur inside the Batcave. And of course, Alfred calls him out and tells him to get out of that thing. Now, the cool thing about this is Alfred basically hits back home at all really the progression of Superman and Batman. And that's really where the meat and potatoes of the discussion in this video really resides here. When it comes to Batman and Superman, and we've talked about this a million times before, back when DC first made them, there was no shared universe. You just had Batman stories, you had Superman stories, and that was it. They never crossed over, they never met. There was really no reason to. It wasn't until Superman issue number 75 that Batman and Superman met one another. And when they did, it opened up this whole new world, because fans of Batman and fans of Superman were like, oh my God, they're meeting each other. And it was like the coolest thing ever, because that gave rise to stories. If they're friends, then what would happen if they team up? What kind of stories could we get after that? That's exactly what DC started doing. All the world's finest stories, things like that, the crossovers that happened later on down the line. The idea here is that Alfred really makes the case that over the years, the two of them have fought quite a bit. They really just lashed out at each other time and time again. But that's because it took time for them to trust one another. It took time for that friendship to fully blossom. It took time for Batman to say, there's like two people in this world that I trust. One's Alfred and one's Superman. There have been instances over the course of their publication history when that trust has been questioned in a multitude of different ways. Tower of Babel is probably one of the first stories that you're thinking about right now, when Batman's database on how to defeat each member of the Justice League was thrown into the limelight when Ra's al Ghul stole that information and used it against the Justice League. Batman basically had to stand before the League and say, Ra's al Ghul got that information because I assembled it and put it in the Batcave. In case any of you guys went crazy, I didn't trust you enough to believe that you would stay sane. I believed that if you guys went nuts, there'd have to be a way to take you down. That in and of itself is not a bad thing. The fact that he hid it from the Justice League is what made them question his loyalties. But again, this really brings into the sharp relief the whole Batman Superman fight and different things like that. Now, to be honest with you guys, I never bought into the idea that Batman could beat Superman. Not a chance. It's Superman. The guy was pulling planets out of a dying galaxy just because DC wanted to show that he had nothing else to do. That was like the first few panels of a story, and then the actual story happened. I mean, sure, you know, there's been stories where Batman beats Superman, but like if we sat down for a second and we were like, I mean, who would really win? That fight would be 1 page long, and it would be Batman saying something to piss Superman off, and Superman would grab Batman and throw him into the sun. Or maybe he doesn't throw him into the sun. So maybe Superman takes him all the way out to the edge of the explored universe, drops him off, and then comes back to Earth. Hey Batman, just like paddle really hard. Maybe you'll make it back in like 500 million years. I have no idea. Seriously, let's just say this. Batman cannot beat Superman. Mr. Sunday Movies had an amazing video where he's like, Superman could just like kick his head off, or like break his neck, or use heat vision to heat his face up and then make his brain overheat. Anyway, that whole issue aside, the funny thing about this is that when it comes to Jonathan, in terms of how he relates to his current situation, the idea is that Superman really sits down and says, okay, maybe we were wrong for keeping your powers in check. Maybe we were wrong for basically kind of hindering this ability. Because remember, Superman's moral compass derives from a combination of what he learned from the Kents, but also the idea that he had to come to grips with his powers. How is he going to use those powers? And that's how it is for Jonathan Kent. Despite Lois and Superman trying to treat their son like he's a normal kid, he's not a normal kid. He's a kid with incredible abilities. And so if they're going to raise him to become a productive member of society, his powers have to be a part of that. They have to be part of that equation. And so that's what this turns into. It really turns into Superman basically saying, okay, I got to pitch this to Lois. I got to get my wife to agree. But it's basically simply saying Jonathan is going to forge his own path in the world. This also seems to hint at the idea that Jonathan will be inducted into the Teen Titans. Now, of course, this came out before the Teen Titans issue of the whole thing with Jonathan and Damian and so on and so forth, but it's a cool little one-shot. It's a fun little story. Just this idea that Jonathan is really just kind of growing into his own, stepping out and becoming more of a hero, as opposed to a kid who just kind of hung around his dad and watched his dad do some cool things. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna go ahead and bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and yeah, I will catch you all later. Peace.